those take a little bit more work. So we talked about how to do the frequency distribution, how to write out what the classes are, and determine what they are. The thing to remember with that, again, is the class width. You're looking at the difference between consecutive lower class limits. You're not going to look at any of the upper class limits when you're determining the class width. Okay, so these histograms that we're going to do in this class are a little bit different than they do in some books. They try to simplify it a little bit just to make it a little bit easier, which is kind of nice because then you don't have to worry about some extra steps in there called class boundaries, which can get a little bit complicated. So they just make it a little bit simplified, just to make it a little easier for us to do. When we have these, it's going to look similar to a bar graph. The only difference is these things are going to be touching the bars. And we had a bar graph for qualitative data. There was a space in between those two bars. But we're still going to have the height is the frequency or the relative frequency, depending on which one we're doing. And then along the x-axis, we're just going to have the possible values that we can have for the quantitative variables, but they're only going to use, so if we look down here, they're just going to use the lower class limits on these ones. They're not going to throw the upper class limits in there. So for this one, the class was technically 0 to 0.99, and this was 1 to 1.99. They just leave off the upper class limits, and they just use the lower class limits for this. Some books make it a little more complicated, and they adjust those numbers a little bit. But we're just going to stick to lower class limits because it makes it a little bit easier. And then to figure out what the class width is, you can just take these two here, subtract them off, and that'll get you your class width. So if they do give you a histogram and they ask you what's the class width, just take these two numbers and subtract them, because these numbers that they're going to be using are always going to be your lower class limits. So that's how you'll do it for that one. So up here, the graphical form that we're going to be doing is called a histogram, technically. It's not a bar graph anymore if you have quantitative data. So that's going to be called a histogram instead. So it's technically different, but I mean, they look really similar. It's going to be a histogram. So again, we've got a rectangle for each class instead of category, but now they're going to be touching. And then they say the widths are equal to the class width. So we've got these two right here for the particle emissions data that we did on Monday. Notice again how they look exactly the same. They're the same shape, except for just these numbers up here. These are going to be the proportions since it's the relative frequency. This is going to be like actual whole numbers because it's the frequency. Okay, so histograms you can actually do in the TI-84. If you want to, you can. The problem with the TI-84 is they don't really give you an option of setting the class width and the lower class for the first class. Sorry, the lower class limit for the first class. So when you do it on the TI-84 Plus and you get your answer back on the screen, it's not necessarily going to be the same as what you did when you used this frequency distribution here. So notice how they look a little bit different. And that's just because the class width is different, the lower class limit for the first class is different. So it's going to be a little bit different. You can do it on your calculator if you want to. For these types of problems, it's not the best idea because when you're doing multiple choice, picking which one is the correct histogram, you're not going to find one that looks like this because that doesn't have the right class width. So this is a correct histogram, it just isn't using the same method that we're using up here. So the steps are on there if you'd like to do it. We're not going to go into it because I think we've got, is it 65 data values in this one? Is that how many was on the? Yeah, so we've got 65. I'm not going to put all those into my outline. But how you would do it in your calculator, let me pull up the calculator so you can